Greetings to all. Thank you to everyone for being here. I'm Ann Lounsbury. I'm the chair of NYU's Department of Russian Slavic Studies and a member of the Jordan Center's Faculty Advisory Board. As always, we're very grateful to the Jordan Center and today especially to Hillary Gerber for facilitating this. Before we get started in today's event, I'll announce our next two upcoming 19B seminar series lectures. First will be on Wednesday, April 13th at 12:30. We're going to have just one talk in April. And this will be Catherine Bowers of the University of British Columbia and Kate Holland of the University of Toronto. And they'll be presenting their edited volume, Dostoevsky at 200, the novel in modernity. And the собеседники will be Chloe Papadopoulos of Yale and Robin Foyer Miller of Brandeis. So very much looking forward to hearing about that book. And then on Wednesday, May 4th, also at 12:30, Ludmila Trigos and Carol Euland will be presenting their collected volume, the title of which is Literary Biographies in the Lives of Remarkable People series in Russia, Biography for the Masses. Okay, thank you very much. And I think Hillary has already done her technical announcement and started recording. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's speaker and собеседник. We are very excited to hear from Sergei Antonov of Yale University, who's going to talk to us about Russia's rogue rulers, trials for embezzlement and corruption in post-reform courts, 1866 to 1882. And also thank you to our собеседник, Steve Nafziger of Williams College. We're especially grateful to Steve because our original previously announced собеседник, Harriet Murov, was unable to make it due to family issues. So we're particularly grateful to Stephen for agreeing to participate on very short notice. So thank you, Sergei.
Thank you, Anne, for this introduction. And also thank you everyone for coming and giving these difficult times to get any work done or to even pay much attention to other people's work, even though we're mostly safe here in the US. I am very grateful to this wonderful, amazing group for hosting my presentation, to Bella, to Sarah, to Sasha, and of course, I have to join Anne in extending my huge gratitude to Stephen for jumping in, and I think our deepest sympathies go out to Harriet and to her family. So I am going to present this kind of new half-baked work chapter from my book. I would really appreciate comments from this wonderful interdisciplinary crowd, from Stephen, since he is an economic historian, and I have a feeling I'm not going to get very many economic historians reading this book until after it's out, and people who will be reading this manuscript are mostly going to be literature scholars. So I think it's like this presentation is just super important to me on all kinds of ways. And so what I want to do is that I do want to say a few words about the book project overall, and then hopefully quickly move to the actual new material that I have not presented before to this saintly old man who stole 17 pounds of cash from Russia as orphans. So the book itself is my first book dealt with pre-reform law and the culture of debt, as I think some of you know. And this book kind of sort of deals with different issues. It deals with criminal justice and deals with the period after the court reform of 1864. Which since this is a 19th century seminar, all of you kind of have some idea of what it did. It established a new court system, was opened in 1866, oral procedure rather than written procedure, juries in criminal cases, and newly reorganized legal profession. So, so very much kind of a new kind of sort of new edifice, so to say, building on an earlier tradition of legality. Substantive law at the same time, the actual legal rules, say this is murder, this is theft, and so on, remain the same from the 1830s and 40s. And also demand for legal services that was very considerable under Nicholas I, kind of skyrocketed in the 1860s and 70s. So one way, I would say, to describe what was happening in Russia at this time is to use Pierre Bourdieu's terminology and to say that the reform basically rebuilt what he calls a juridical field, meaning this body of professionals, a body of experts who practice law, who define, most importantly, define the law's boundaries, and they compete with each other to establish the law's internal logic, and who are internally constrained by that logic, the logic of the law. And I would share in the common response to Bourdieu that in addition to these legal experts, we need to include, laypersons, jurors, journalists, even spectators. So existing literature on Russian law that I'm, very much building on shows a robust legal culture. And I'm especially indebted, of course, to my teacher, Richard Wortman, and also to very helpful work, more specifically by Girish Bhat, by Georg Babirovsky, by Louise McReynolds, and also to historians, to Elise Wirtschafter, Jane Burbank, Michelle Marisi, all of whom drastically changed our understanding of the Russian juridical field. At the same time, we barely scratched the surface here. One sort of thing where I'm building on is that I'm kind of extending choice of topics, looking at the substance of legal cases, whereas existing literature kind of tends to look more at court organization, procedure, sort of implementation of reform, and also, of course, Harriet Murav's work was kind of in this law and literature tradition also is very, very notable. But I'm looking at the substance of legal cases to borrow from legal scholar Robert Cover. I'm looking at the narratives that give meaning to the legal norms, to normas, as he calls it. So I'm looking at the stories that kind of make law come alive. And I'm also looking at the institution and the culture of a major public trial as a kind of like a discrete historical phenomenon. I'm looking at the way public trials specifically rebuild Russian juridical field. And I would say that this kind of idea, the practice of a public trial was probably, the most important innovation in terms of the legal reform, working, of course, together with sort of newly sort of semi-emancipated press, and showing this kind of shift that Michel Foucault is describing. So there's this shift throughout European legal systems to kind of like non-public institutional disciplines, prisons, and so on. But at the same time, we see this process by which spectacular emotional aspects of the law, of criminal justice, of law enforcement, they don't disappear, but they're shifted from the public square into the courtroom that is public, but also very much circumscribed. So one of the sort of first things that I've noticed is that virtually all the important criminal trials of the post-reform era involved members of Russia's elite, either as defendants or as victims, or maybe both. And this is true across the entire spectrum of criminal activity. This includes violent crime, political crime. And also what I'm discussing here is, I'm going to move to the next slide, to financial or white-collar crime, the age of fraud, as the Russians called it at the time. That includes, I think those of you who study Imperial Russia, they would remember those names, Mother Mitrofania, who you can see on this slide, who ran this kind of extensive people argued, I think it's debatable, around this fraud operation. The millionaire arsonist Ovsyannikov, who burned down his giant mechanical mill. The Moscow bank case, the bank failure, Moscow Commercial Loan Bank in 1875, and the Skopin Municipal Bank, Russia's first giant pyramid scheme. So there's definitely this kind of a attempt to restructure, rebuild Russian elite Russian ruling classes. And so the ruling class, and I'm sort of borrowing a little bit here from the elite theory. There are a bunch of people who've been writing, beginning with Alfredo Pareto, of course, and other figures subsequently. So the Russian elite was deeply fragmented, of course, but was also held together by common mentalities, common education, what Catriona Kelly calls common culture of gentility, but also property ownership, and this kind of like set of social issues with which they were engaging. And so I'm arguing along with the routine stratum of the criminal justice system, with tens of thousands of burglars and pickpockets and drunken fights, and also 1 or 2,000 of like routine murder cases per year. There's this set of large-scale public trials, and there were remarkably many of them happening almost every year. They did something more than just kind of publish murder, theft, or fraud. And also more than just show that even elite defendants were subject to the law. Rather, I get this impression that there was this conscious effort to rebuild a Russian ruling class to adapt to these post-emancipation realities. And in the process, part of the process was to expose the inner workings of that elite, including such things as private and family life, economic relations and activities, but also various mentalities, mental attitudes, loyalties, conflicts, and so on. Some certain behaviors and relations, certain cultural models of behavior were criticized and punished, and others were praised. And so what is happening here before these trials, while they were being put together and in a courtroom, is something that we can borrow from Mikhail Bakhtin, his notion of carnival, and which kind of Foucault follows to some extent as well, when the lords, the rulers are exposed and denigrated, and the peasants, who were also involved in these elite trials in various capacities, peasants are given this kind of attention, the spotlight. Also, this is not to say that there was this attempt to rebuild the ruling class, the elites, the power structures. But this is not to say that there was a single authority that was trying to do this, and there was a single discourse that was just imposed on everybody. So I don't want to say that there was this traditional old-fashioned Russia that was on trial, and the modernity was triumphant. I mean, it's really just kind of confusing things. Rather, I would say that everything, all of these narratives and stories were sharply contested. Here, Bakhtin's another notion of polyphony is really helpful. You have this multitude of voices in a courtroom that are kind of competing with each other. So one very prominent subset of this kind of high-profile fraud case involves something that's very commonly but completely, I think, not quite correctly viewed as this kind of uniquely Russian affliction, which is a company embezzlement, official corruption, bribery, or criminal negligence. So this particular type of white-collar crime is different from other types that I discuss in other chapters, such as solo swindlers, basically illegitimate persons participating in the economy completely illegitimately, but also this is different from criminal capitalists like Mitrofania or Ovsyannikov or Strusberg, the German millionaire, or Rykov, the pyramid scheme guy. People who were, they were fraudsters, they were criminals, but at the same time, they weren't stealing from their own organization, right? So here I'm looking at a few cases of people who basically they had power, completely legitimate power, and completely legitimate banks, government agencies, and they're basically stealing from their own. Okay, and the key stories here, and there are a bunch of others that I'm not including in this presentation, and I'm not even mentioning them, but some of the key stories is General Politkovsky, who in 1853 stole the sort of vast amount of money from the veterans and the War Invalids Fund that was set up after the War of 1812. Also, there was this chap called Gaevsky who oversaw Holy Synod's educational establishments, basically all the seminaries and schools like that. And in 1867, he stole a bunch of money from them. There was a famous salt scandal in 1867 when this official Verderevsky in the city of Nizhny Novgorod stole Russia's entire strategic salt reserve, tens of thousands of tons of salt. the Moscow Commercial Loan Bank in 75, 76, multi-million bank crash. This man, cashier of another bank in Petersburg, Konstantin Yuhantsov, who stole, over 1 million rubles, so much money that like it was hard to figure out what he even was planning to do with that amount. And finally, Fyodor Melnitsky, that I'm going to talk about sort of later on in this talk. This is the man who stole from the Russian orphans. So there are actually quite a few cases like that, but I would say that any kind of quantitative studies, no, my apologies to Steve, of course, are quantitative study at this point. I mean, I think it's pretty difficult for a couple of reasons. One is that the archives are pretty ransacked for the post-reform period. Even like the Senate archives, for example, the Senate tried some of the high-level corruption scandals, but also because there are so many white-collar crime issues and cases and scandals where they were never made public. And I'm not even talking about those embezzlers who were never caught, of course, right? Because like only the bad ones were exposed. But the impression that I get is that there's a very extensive literature on white-collar crime in Victorian England and in the US. And so I just think like this kind of argument that Russian bureaucrats were exceptionally corrupt or immune from the law is just like doesn't really hold water very much. And you compared to this, this literature from other parts of the world, and also I want to make the point that you simply can't really have corruption without something to define it against. You need, and other people have said that about Russian law today. Like you need a certain amount of honest people to, to have corruption, right? So my objective here is not really simply to find out who the embezzlers were and how they went about their business, how they were caught, but primarily to find out what factors created this kind of culture of embezzlement, this narrative of corruption, this kind of a public cause célèbre, and on how that was constructed. And so in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to talk about one exceptionally influential embezzlement scandal, and I'm going to try to highlight some of the sort of key themes in my chapter. Oops, sorry about that. So the example I'm going to talk about comes from Moscow, comes from 1882 and 1883. And the example comes from the Moscow Orphanage, which, as I think you know, and there's some literature in our field about it by David Ransel, for example, that it was probably the most massive operation of that kind in Europe at that time. Real charitable empire. There was this воспитательный дом, as they called it, the central facility in the view of the Kremlin, as you can see in this painting. It had educational, medical facilities, out services, even a money lending operation that before 1859 was Imperial Russia's most important mortgage bank. And so from the legal standpoint, I would call that it was kind of like a hybrid institution, really, because it was a state institution. It was run by a board of trustees appointed by the emperor, and its staff, its chinovniki, they had official rankings under the table of ranks. But at the same time, like they were not part of the regular ministerial bureaucracy. They operated autonomously, and they had their own sources of funding. The endowment was pretty significant for its time. Now, if you sort of know how finances worked at that time, 16 million rubles was a pretty good amount. Considering that, say, like the Ministry of Education had like, I don't know, 40 or 50 millions a year. So the annual operating budget was 1.2 million rubles, which is also a heck of a lot of money. You could, fill the Baltic Sea with battleships with that kind of cash. And so imagine the shock in Moscow when on a nasty November day in 1881, the chief treasurer of the orphanage shows up at the city's procurator's office. In the middle of the day, he's literally crying, and he says that, I had a dizzy spell. I lost a whole suitcase in which he was carrying 6 months worth of cash, over 300,000 rubles. So it was supposed to operate orphanage for 6 months. And so he received that cash from the central bank, from the from the government's account in the central bank. He was just walking it over to another bank where the orphanage had its account. He was supposed to deposit that cash. Then he suddenly had a fainting spell. And like, if you know that area, Solyanka, right, like Kuzynensky most, like there are a bunch of ups and downs. Even today it looks a little messy. At that time, there was a lot of construction, logs, random people just kind of moving around. And so he sat down on a log and a pile of construction junk, and then a couple of minutes later he regained consciousness, and the money was gone. Sort of like a scene from The Diamond Arm, right? Like очнулся Gibbs. So this guy, Fyodor Ilyadorovich Milnitsky, was, he was a saintly looking old man. He was described as a kindly old chap, Mili Dedushka, 51 years old, and the police were very sympathetic to him, but his supervisor, the director of the orphanage, who immediately accused him of stealing the money and started the investigation and had him arrested, which he was kind of obligated to do, of course. And for about a year, the police desperately, or maybe not so desperately, but they were trying to find where the money went. Because if it was some random thief that stole it, he probably tried to pass those banknotes, right? But Milnitsky denied everything. He just kind of portrayed this kind of saintly image, and numerous searches of his apartments and of apartments of everyone he knew just did absolutely nothing. They didn't find anything. And so in the rest of the talk, in the 20 minutes that I have left, I'm going to just give you a little bit of a flavor of the investigation that followed, and the kind of like the two narratives that were constructed during the investigation and during the two trials that followed. And I think it's really important. It's I'm not going to make any contemporary references here for obvious reasons, but in terms of how Russia operated, the sort of the deep state. I don't mean a conspiracy theory deep state, but these kind of informal, non-public power structures operated in Russia. And probably operate to this day. So one sort of type of narratives I'm discussing in my first section are these kind of scripts about personal character, personal corruption, and sort of personal autonomy, personal motivations. That's sort of one set of scripts. The second set is more kind of technical in character. Slightly less developed in this chapter, but I'm still working on this. I call it kind of the habitus of embezzlement, again, to borrow from Pierre Bourdieu. I'm looking at how organizations were set up, what kind of precautions were taken or not taken, how those precautions were subverted, and how embezzler and why the embezzler was finally caught. And I'm kind of referring to this kind of a big bang moment, right? When the embezzler is identified and what kind of price he had to pay. So that's the second set of narratives. And the third set of narratives that I literally just ran out of time to kind of write it up in more detail, but it's unfortunately probably the most important one, is I'm looking at this underlying background inquiry that in some cases that inquiry was more overt than in others, but it was present in all of these corruption scandals. That we can sum this up with this very well-known cliche, and then it was made famous by Paul Milyukov, of course, in 1916, but I'm positive he didn't invent it. Was it stupidity or was it treason, right? So we have this like inquiry into the overall qualities of the Russian ruling class, this question whether Russian elites are disloyal, and I mean to the nation, to each other, to the Tsar, to the state, to the public, to the people, and so on. So are they disloyal, or are they too incompetent to run things? Which one of those was the case? And this kind of tension I'm seeing in all of those corruption scandals. And I will discuss this a little bit more towards the end. And as you can see, it's super relevant if you've been following the news like literally over the last 24 hours, right? It's if you look at the discourse that's happening in Russia right now, it seems like it's this timeless issue, and this is just kind of one of those I would say like not the first time it's manifested in the public discourse, but this is a very short time after public discourse became possible in Russia, right? So I think it's really helps us to pay attention to what was happening. So so moving on to like theme number one about this kind of personal character and personal motivations. So we're moving to the investigation, and basically the first thing that the police are trying to do, they're trying to find out whether our guy Fyodor Melnitsky, whether he really did do it, like whether he was the kind of guy who's capable of stealing orphans' money. And here, you typically corruption and fraud trials would try to set up this opposition between the old and the new, as a sort of very famous prosecutor, Nikolai Muravyov, would put it, like the sort of the progeny of the fallen old order, Исчадие павшего барства. It's like difficult to translate that phrase. Исчадие павшего барства. So like the Russian prosecutors really love to show how like this kind of old regime inherited from serfdom is basically preventing this kind of new fair marketplace and new fair society from developing. It was very common in a lot of white-collar crime trials, but here is one of those examples when sort of a clear-cut divisions between the old and the new, modernity and tradition, just simply don't work, right? And then the more complicated and more interesting trials, you're going to have this kind of polyphonic sort of regime. So because why didn't it help? Because Magnitsky, he had no bad habits. So he was used to be a serf owner in the olden days, but it was also clear that he adapted very well. He, invested his money. He served on the local zemstva. He educated his children. He made all the right moves, basically. So, like, you can't really. And in any case, by the time we get to 1881, serfdom had been abolished, 20 years ago. So you can't really say that he was some kind of leftover from the old age of serfdom. But you also couldn't tell that he was some kind of crazed new regime capitalist, like this German railroad tycoon Stussberg, who looted Moscow Commercial Loan Bank in the 1870s. So because there's no evidence like Melnitsky was, gambling or playing the stock market or making crazy investments, he was just very sober, didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't, have any other kind of faults, was very religious. And so the prosecution was basically kind of stuck, and they preferred to portray him as essentially like a loner with, maybe with a screw loose, so to say. He just kind of like chose to do it, and we're not even going to try to get into his head too much. The only sort of thing that stands out here is this very much non-publicized, and meaning that I had to like look at the background investigation files from the archive, is that there was a very serious effort to turn this into a political case, right? And so usually we assume that political trials and non-political trials were kind of two very distinct things at that time, right? So you have political cases of revolutionaries and then non-political cases of thieves and murderers. And but I'm finding that like there was a lot more interpenetration, and so in this case, the government. Well, they first of all, I mean, they suspected that Melnitsky may have stolen this money to give it to the revolutionaries, and they even arrested Melnitsky's daughter, who was denounced as a nihilistka by some of Melnitsky's co-workers. And she was a little bit bold in her judgments, so to say, and she would socialize with young men, even in their apartments, believe it or not. And so, and she was attending the Высшие женские курсы, the higher education courses in Moscow. So clearly suspicious. And then there was even suspicion that she knew this famous revolutionary Olga Lubatovich. However, that did not quite work out, and there's a lot of this background, hundreds of pages of background investigation and correspondence about how Muravyov from Petersburg and sort of people in Moscow were trying to turn this into a political case. But also there was this kind of like whiff of political disloyalty put in the final case by just kind of like hinting that Melnitsky, even though he was from the Tver province, had like Polish connections of some kind. Like he allegedly tried to obtain count's title from the authorities in Warsaw. And he was also described as a Jesuit-like person in the indictment. So there was this kind of this very kind of important kind of undercurrent of political disloyalty. But eventually, so the government put this guy on trial, and it ended up being one of those cases that attracted a lot of public attention for a lot of reasons, of course. But one of the reasons was that evidence against Magnitsky was completely slim, very direct. Everybody knew he must have done it, right? But so the question was like, what was the right thing to do for the jury? Convict him because everybody knew he did it, or acquit him because it was not really, you really need like evidence other than just some kind of like, well, he must have done it. Who else could have done it? And so eventually, I mean, he was convicted. Magnitsky was convicted, and people kind of were on the fence about this. They weren't sure. But eventually, the case ended up basically a vindication of the jury trial just at the time when, no, after the 1881 assassination, it was under attack. So, because a month later, after Magnitsky was convicted, the police finally located the money. All of that was more or less hidden in plain sight in his children's and relatives' apartments, which kind of suggests that the police weren't looking very hard before. And then the children are arrested. They all go on trial. And guess what? They're all acquitted, even though they admitted to doing this. They're like, yes, our father, made us do it, and we just kind of obeyed him. And so what I'm arguing here, and very briefly, is that the second trial and actually the entire Magnitsky scandal is basically kind of like a hard inquiry into the modern Russian family, and I think that explains this weird result. People, were asking like, what is really worse? Whether it would be worth saying that like this is what the Russian youth is like today, because that's what you would say if you're convicted that whole family, or maybe, or is it worse to just acquit and let the guilty people go free? And so it seems like that, we obviously don't know what the jury said, but it seems like this was interpreted at the time as like the Magnitsky family was acquitted out of this kind of sense of hierarchy. In other words, the jury pretended that they believed that the children helped their father out of sense of filial duty and obedience. Right, and so everyone was happy. So what I would say, this is like Brothers Karamazov in reverse, right? So like instead of turning your father in, you just kind of did what he wants you to do. And notice the year, right? This is like 1881, 1882. So Dostoevsky always had his hand on the pulse, so to say, knowing how Crime and Punishment came out, for example, right in the middle of the very kind of similar trial. Okay, so theme number two, and it looks like I have about 10 minutes, so the last two themes. So theme number two is this kind of habitus of corruption, or landscape of corruption. There are sort of a couple of things here. One is that these kind of scandals, embezzlement, bribery, and so on, it looks like they tended to target a particular type of institution, like charity funds of various kinds, educational sort of authorities, or also people, things like salt storage. So those agencies in the government that had like an important economic function, or like road construction and stuff like that. So in other words, of course, the central ministry, like the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of the Interior, and of course, patronage was rampant, and every sort of high official would have like his own circle of clients. But no, there's a big difference between appointing your school chum to a cushy job, right, and stealing 17 pounds of cash from orphans, right? There are big differences. So these kind of like more sort of prominent corruption scandals, they tended to target these kind of institutions that handled a lot of wild money and that had like considerable autonomy from oversight. Okay, so that's kind of one technique, I guess, of corruption. The other technique is what are the scripts? What are the sort of the stories that you can see in these cases? Most importantly, how did these thieves, justify what they did to themselves, perhaps? One common justification was that, well, I did it for other people. I didn't do it for myself. Like, Magnitsky did it for his children. And there's this other guy, Yuhantsov, did it because his wife had expensive tastes and so on. So like, I'm not really doing it for myself. That's sort of one explanation. The second explanation, well, I'm really not stealing this money because I'm just borrowing it. I'm going to pay it back. I'm going to give it back. And sometimes they did pay it back, some of it back. But it seems like it was a very common practice. You just kind of like dip into the money that's under your care, but like and then you're trying to repay it. And if you do manage to repay it, then like and you're later caught, the punishment was much milder. So then the sort of the third kind of a justification is that, well, I'm not really stealing the money. I'm just kind of like, this money is just sitting there, not doing anything. I'm just using it to make loans to just kind of help myself. So you would have, Magnitsky especially was famous, well, infamous for that, because he conducted a lot of small embezzlements over the years. He would basically issue loans to like his fellow officials and to other people, other chinovniki in Moscow, and he would, charge them the interest rate, and he would basically would pocket the interest. Of course, the danger here is that if somebody doesn't pay you back, then you're going to be in real trouble, right? Because you borrowed that money from the treasury. And there were the St. Petersburg Gaevsky official of the Holy Synod scandal in 1867 was one example of that. Gaevsky was using money to make loans, and then his borrower didn't pay him back. So Gaevsky was caught because he didn't have the cash. So there are all these kind of justification, all kinds of mental tricks. Some of them were not exactly voluntary, like those kind of internal pyramid schemes where like you steal money, and then you have to like steal more money to cover up what you have stolen earlier, and that just kind of tended to snowball. Okay, so a lot of those kind of self-delusional kind of explanations. A little bit about precautions and how they were subverted, because obviously banks, government agencies, charitable funds, they knew that they had a lot of money. They knew that they were on board members, company board members were, they were liable for losses if they didn't find the criminal, the embezzler. And so and there were actually sort of a lot of very reasonable precautions. One is that the clerk, the employer, the cashier, the treasurer had to post a bond, like you had provide a certain amount of property to sort of protect your employer if you embezzled. There were detailed regulations about reporting audits and things like that, and there were sudden inspections, although these didn't seem to have worked very well. Because obviously all these embezzlers evaded for many years all of those security measures, but also physical safety, where seals and strong boxes and vaults, those were pretty difficult to circumvent. Like one of our embezzlers, cashier Yuhantsev from Petersburg, he would just forge the seal. And nobody would on like packets with the bonds that he was stealing. And so nobody thought to, like, as long as the seal was intact, nobody thought to actually open it and see if the papers were still there, which they were not. And another sort of important precaution was using, was to make sure that there's a proper social circle in a business organization, that superiors were able to kind of control and supervise what the cashier was doing. That there was never like a single person fully in charge of the money, that he would have like a couple of peers, like he would have a bookkeeper, a cashier, a controller. They could all like basically snitch on each other. And also that there were subordinates, like there was this idea, counter, счетчик, who would usually be a lower class individual, like a former soldier, who was supposed to basically like accompany all cash, be physically present. So like nobody could just like come up to a cashier, knock him on the head and take the money. Okay, so a lot of precautions, and if you have more questions about this, I'm really happy to talk about them. And then sort of the final kind of technique is this process of discovery and catharsis, a cathartic moment of truth, which started with the rumors that our embezzler was stealing some money or living beyond his means, followed by this kind of limbo moment when people were kind of sure that this person was stealing, but like they were still hoping that he could still avoid the scandal, that he would somehow, maybe borrow the money to make up the law. So there's some kind of explanation that's legitimate. And then this limbo moment would be followed by this kind of big bang discovery, an inspection or a confession perhaps, or some kind of anonymous report, at which point our embezzler would be arrested, and at that point, he or his family would try to hide his property from being seized by the government. His relatives would try to find the property, but usually you would have seizures, you would have arrest, imprisonment, and complete dishonor, for the embezzler and his family if he had any. Or the police would and some random witnesses of the government would go through your property, would go through their icons, go through their underwear, and just seize everything basically. So just this kind of like a ritual of denigration. Okay, so now quickly I have like 2 or 3 minutes, unfortunately, but to give you guys a chance to ask questions. But I still I haven't talked about the third theme of negligence, the sort of this theme of negligent rulers. One of the most interesting things about the Melnitsky scandal is that some of the lawyers in the case, and especially this very well-known lawyer Vladimir Gerard, who's kind of like known for arguing these kind of cheeky cases, he accused the orphanage basically of being negligent, of not supervising Melnitsky and actually benefiting. By taking some of the board members were taking loans from Melnitsky and kind of benefiting from his corruption. And also Gerard accused the police of taking the whole year to find the money, while it was, almost the whole time it was hidden, in a dresser with dirty underwear, right? And so we have this theme of negligence that is present, in one way or another in literally every embezzlement case and in most fraud cases that I've ever looked at. Well, that said, it was really just a background, but there were specifically criminal negligence cases that did come on trial occasionally, but not nearly as often because they were more difficult to prove and they involved, much smaller punishments. So like for embezzlement, one would go to Siberia in exile, and for criminal negligence, like if you just didn't pay attention when somebody was stealing the money, it would be just a few months arrest. And typically, negligence was invoked in cases of railway crashes and steamship collisions and things like that, like the infamous Telugu train crash in 1875, for which was very deadly, for which Sergei, the future prime minister, took the fall and was sentenced to an arrest, or the ship crash on Lake Ladoga in 1873. And I love this one. It's like the boat called Tsaritsa, the Tsarina Tsaritsa, rammed another boat that was called the Tsar and sank it. So it's like Tsaritsa sinking the Tsar, but it wasn't nearly as fun for the people who ended up being killed, and there were a lot of people who were killed. So intuitively you would think, and that's kind of last thing I'm going to say, intuitively you would think when you look at this kind of background tension between individual agency and rational choice and this kind of background of kind of sloth and negligence, you would think the prosecutors would push this negligence angle a little bit more, right? Because just like in England, in English white-collar crime cases, to prove fraud, right, you had to prove intention, right? So like an innocent mistake was pretty common defense, and you would think that it would be really better for the state, better for the establishment, to show that the likes of Melnitsky and other people like him, that they were just stupid, right? They were not vicious, they just kind of didn't know what they were doing. However, the trend in these prosecutions went the other way. And the thrust was to show that corruption was an individual choice of a few rotten individuals who would be expelled from the respectable ranks of respectable society. When they were convicted, sent to Siberia, sometimes allowed to go back after a few years. And somehow this ended up being a lot better than to admit that the entire ruling class in Russia was too distracted or too selfish or too stupid, to even look after its own stuff, or even to allege, as some people said in the bank embezzlement case in Moscow, that basically these investors and shareholders, they kind of intentionally pulled back and let these embezzling managers to just kind of make risky investments and kind of play risky games in the stock market, just basically insulate themselves from risk. So there's a lot of tension, and I am finding it in kind of all over the place, really. Okay, so I'm gonna actually stop here and look forward to Stephen's remarks. So again, so there were these 3 themes that I identified in this trial, sort of personal narratives, kind of techniques of embezzlement and its detection, and then finally this kind of tension, this motif of negligent rulers, the ruling class, who are not just disloyal but also kind of too stupid to rule, right? I'm finding it to be very kind of persistent in Russian juridical field. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and to Steve's comments, of course. So thanks again.
Thank you, Sergei. Steve, your thoughts?
Great, thanks everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm definitely a poor substitute for Harriet, so my apologies ahead of time. So I'm an economic historian, actually an economist by training. Happens to work on 19th century Russia, and I think, you know, one reason this is a particularly interesting topic for me is recently I've been engaged in a big project with Amanda Gregg at Middlebury on sort of corporations and sort of late 19th century Russia. Sort of think of Tom Owen's work, sort of 2.0, if you will. And so that's my lens, at least broadly speaking, my field lens for thinking about Sergei's wonderful piece of legal history. And I think I'm just going to highlight sort of a couple thoughts that occurred to me as I read through. And these are all actually related, I think, to the third theme that Sergei just mentioned. So this sort of Milukov's, you know, stupidity or treason question that Sergei poses several times. The sort of statement about whether the imperial ruling class was really incompetent, were they disloyal, or neither in some sense. And I think there's sort of two issues this brings up if we sort of center that particular question here. One has to do with sort of the overarching structure of, and you know, Sergei mentioned the judicial reforms of the 1860s. You could think of other things that are happening out of the great reforms. This sort of structure of, you could call it sort of modern or even appropriate or something, legal and government, ministries, courts, you know, a whole system of management of the economy or, you know, political life, if you will. That sort of, it seems like they were set up in a way that was, you know, that akin to many sort of more advanced countries, you might call it. But in practice, how did they work? This is sort of a perennial question. And I think more particularly in this case, did they generate the right, how did they generate incentives for people to behave either loyally or disloyally or competently or incompetently? And I think Sergei was hinting at that, sort of thinking about along these lines. Were the systems of promotion, of hiring and firing, of pay itself, were they set up in a way that enabled or discouraged such behavior by people like Khmelnytsky? I think there's a vast historical literature to sort of draw on, not just about the structure and overarching or the sort of new institutions created after the reforms, not just in Russia, but even comparatively across sort of Western Europe. Another aspect of this, I think, that is useful in thinking of these new structures that are generated in the 1860s, in other words, is sort of that they're pretty modern, they're sort of advanced, and they're new. And this would not include sort of, you know, corporate law or particular aspects of the law that the behavior of these individuals might touch on is sort of being newly codified or recodified at this time. I'm thinking actually in particular about accounting. I've thought overwhelmingly and sort of sadly, maybe way too much about accounting practices in the late 19th century. And I think this is something that you know, that generated a whole lot of gray areas or blind spots, whether, you know, external auditing or internal auditing or keeping the books. And I think this is something that could be drawn out even a little bit more in this. I think this is something that's not just Russia specific, but broadly speaking across the sort of Western European and affiliate countries at this time. Because my 5 minutes will wrap up quickly, I just want to mention sort of the other big thing that came again out of this stupidity or treason question for me. And again, Sergei hinted at this, and I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, and it's not something that can be easily answered. and I sort of think of this as the denominator question. If we see these incidences of corruption, of malfeasance, of white collar crime, how can we scale it? How can we really be comparative? And thinking broadly is like, is Russia somewhat different or experiencing something different than the United States or England or France at the same time? And the answer really might depend at the end of the day on how exactly these sources get generated and then kept over time, which you hinted at, and compare that to sort of how they're generated and utilized in the books, as you mentioned, on Victorian England or in the United States. In particular, the sort of public nature of these trials relative to sort of the incidence of such corruption elsewhere may or may not impact the sort of the lens we have to look at such malfeasance in the Russian case. Because I think the bottom line question then is, what made Russia different? What made the Russian experience of such white collar crime and, broadly speaking, sort of official or semi-official corruption different or unique? And I would just want to close with three sort of quick observations of things that seem maybe possibly different in the Russian context. And one is the role of this very extended sort of household networks that you read about, you see about. If you're watching Bridgerton these days, you might note in the British context as well. But it really seems evident in the case you bring up. And I'm just wondering how sort of thinking more along the lines of that might be useful. The second is the role of sort of Krishi in this context relative to other contexts. And I'm aware of some work on sort of British officialdom that thinks about, that's, if you're some higher official, you have your set of men, always men here, and what their behavior, how their behavior might be affected by having this sort of structure of possible corruption in place. And for the final point I want to say, which actually has to do with orphanages, those are interesting institutions in the Russian context. And I think you're right to highlight that they're not unique in the Russian context. There are these other sort of semi-official or official, highly endowed, well-positioned institutions that actually acted in very interesting ways in terms of lending as financial intermediaries, if you will. That seems a bit unique to the Russian context. They're sort of substituting for maybe more formal banking or other financial institutions. So I'm just highlighting those sort of three things. There could be many more that struck me at the end of the day as something that might be a unique way to frame or to reflect back on the sort of the bigger issues of the sort of stupidity or treason question. Thanks.
Stephen, thank you very much for those remarks. And we'll open it up to questions.
So my question, Sergei, first I just want to thank you for this really interesting presentation, and Stephen also for those interesting comments. I wanted to build on Stephen's last point, actually, because I was also intrigued by the orphanage as an institution as a broader metaphor for the idea of not corruption, but for the blurry boundary between official and unofficial and state and non-state. Was the orphanage under the rubric of something like a popečitelstvo?
Опекунский совет.
What now?
Опекунский совет.
Опекунский совет, okay. I'm thinking of a phenomenon from a little bit of a later period, but that had to do with the development of municipal infrastructure in Moscow and otherwise. And one of the things that I recall is most notable about the institutions that were leveraged to do that in Moscow, these popečitelstva, was that they were these expressly philanthropic cum state bodies. Do I have that right? And I guess I'm curious about those kinds of institutions and the role that they play in muddying the waters around this. I mean, it's an ideal type, right? That there's going to be, that we're going to be able to articulate out non-corrupt behavior from personal networks and all of that. So I'm curious about that institution and the definition of corruption, as it were, or fraud. And perhaps it does not matter because it's a behavioral thing rather than a relational thing, as you're describing it, which was something that also jumped out. Thank you again so much.
So should I respond, or what's the procedure? Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Anne, for these wonderful questions. I think this is just so super helpful. I'm just so excited. Can't wait to get back to my computer again. But like, I guess I will begin with, I want to give you guys a chance to ask more questions, but to respond very briefly, I think what Anne was referring to was this Dvoriansky opeki, maybe. So like every province had this kind of board, charitable board that was supposed to like take care of like orphan nobles and stuff like that. In terms of like early Soviet period, obviously you didn't have nobles, but that's kind of your specialty.
No? Oh, no. I'm talking about the imperial period though. And these were neighborhood level institutions within the municipal government in Moscow. And they were devoted to especially building worker housing. That was their aim, at any rate.
Okay. Well, yes. So I think that's what I'm finding here is that there has been since earlier in the 19th century this kind of weird type of a quasi-state institution that I've run across it in my first book where I wrote about prisons, and there was this like prison committee that was supposed to be private, but it was run by officials. And then eventually it just became the prison department of the Ministry of the Interior. What I'm finding is for the purposes of this chapter, it's really kind of striking how the law basically started out by treating private corruption much more leniently than official corruption. But as we're moving into the great reforms and you have more and more like large, complicated private organizations emerging, the law basically kind of equated, sort of it made, stealing from a private institution, like a large bank, subject to the same rules as stealing from, by a government official. So it was like a very interesting kind of extra security added to these things. In terms of the kind of trusteeships that you're discussing, I haven't come across sort of cases involving these, but I have to be honest, like the amount of material in the archives that I saw, like especially while I was looking mostly at the Ministry of Justice archives, it's just so enormous. I didn't even scratch the surface. It's just you don't know where to start. So, but by my sense, by looking at the OPC, is that there was at that level, municipal level, like there were a lot of scandals like that, a lot of like local zemstva and local upravi and justices of the peace, like they got into trouble all the freaking time. So it was, and it's important, kind of ties in with Steve's question about the incentives for these kind of mid-level officials to behave. How do you find the right combination of the stick and carrot, so to say? And obviously, you're not going to have this kind of new rebuilt modern elite if you don't find a way for it to police itself. And it does seem, that much, I think, like in Russian judiciary today, it's like corruption is rampant, but at the same time, like it's not completely pervasive, in other words. So like you have, certain, like Russian, I hope you guys are not like recording me too much, but you know how like Russian police are just like notoriously horrendous, right? Everybody knows that. But like it's also like if you listen to the chatter among like what these policemen are saying among themselves, it's like it's not like every cop in Russia is dirty, right? Like they have a certain amount of clean cops to kind of do the work, right? Which is like very, very striking. So thank you, Anne, for this question, and thank you, Steve, for these really, really helpful observations. I think it kind of really helps me to kind of revise this chapter in terms of incentive to behave in sort of new accounting structures. So yeah, there's this book about white-collar crime in Victorian England by George Robb that argues that sort of accounting standards were kind of like intentionally vague and lenient in the late 19th, early 20th century. But at the same time, there's this other work by James Taylor that kind of shows that like the standards were low, but sort of the rigor of private prosecutions was kind of on the rise, basically, as you're moving through the 19th century. Like the standards were low, but like people were getting more and more up at arms in terms of enforcing them. In my cases, I see like tons of forensic accounting stuff. Some of it is very complicated and fascinating, and I'll hopefully unpack it a little bit in the book. But basically, yes. So like, I mean, there were these books, and sometimes my geroi, as we would say, my characters would forge them. They would present, instead of presenting actual books, they would present like little excerpts from the books that would be falsified. Like, I mean, there were all kinds of ways around it. But in terms of how to select, how not to make your entire empire go down, much earlier than it actually did. I mean, I am like sort of one feeling that I have is to borrow from Kirill Solovyov's book on the state council and this kind of like this kind of a legal officialdom, and he argues that there was this certain ethos, common ethos in among these kind of guys. He kind of borrows on Richard Workman, of course, too. That basically all these people all knew each other, and they were educated in the same institutions, and so that's kind of made it a little difficult to sometimes to go all out. So and also in terms of how we scale this, how we compare it. I mean, I think it's absolutely great observations in terms of sort of the three possible distinctions that Steve suggested, especially the crucial one is absolutely true, where one of my heroes, General Politkovsky, stole from the veterans for about 20 years because he was friends with the war minister, Chernyshov, Prince Chernyshov, who is one of those Nicholas I officials, right? I mean, everybody knows who Chernyshov was, the famous former spy, and he was untouchable, right? So if Chernyshov is on your side, then you have nothing to fear. But as soon as Chernyshov retires, then there's a full accounting, and the new and even though the new minister is Chernyshkov's body, but still, like, at least auditors come in and they kind of take you down big time. So it seems like a pretty familiar pattern. Okay. So
thank you, Sergei. And also, I apologize before for going directly into the questions before letting you respond to Steve's comments, but it sounds like you were able to manage to do that. So thank you. I see Chris Rain has her hand up.
Thanks. And thank you, Sergei, for a really interesting talk. So I have a comment on accounting, and then I have a question. So my comment on accounting is that during World War I, when the Russian government took over the companies that were run by foreigners, when they kicked them out. So in my case, in the fashion industry, it was the Mondel ready-to-wear manufacturing, establishment, as well as Singer sewing machine. What happened is that they put the military in charge of them, and they didn't know what they were doing. And they ran the companies literally into the ground. Now, obviously, this is during World War I and all of that, but there is documentation in the archives where the people who've been put in charge basically say, oh my God, I don't know what's happening. I can't get anybody to do anything. I don't know what I'm doing. Please help. So I think there is a real, a very interesting issue here. And that is just a later sort of example, really, of, I think, what it is that you're trying to get at in your, is it stupidity or is it treason question? But my question for you is, so it's fairly commonplace in imperial history for us to, or we've come to the consensus that these public trials that had occurred in the late 19th century, the political trials, did a kind of number on the Russian government. And, it was shown to be, I don't know what you want to say, but it obviously, it contradicted the jury trials. I'm thinking of Yeres and it's kind of discredited the government, that the very legal system that it worked so hard to put in place was now taking the government down, trial by trial, as it were, and publicizing the very people who they wanted to get rid of. So my question to you is, now I realize this is very preliminary, but are you imagining a bigger argument for your corruption trials in a similar way in which the political trials have been used by historians to understand what was happening with perceptions of the Russian government? Question mark, sorry. Thank you.
Yes, Christina, great question, really, because my first impulse when I started working on this project was, everybody can hear me, right? So my first working title here was something like, I don't remember it anymore, but something like, fragmenting Imperial Russia or shattering Imperial Russia or something like that. And my impulse was like sort of the way these trials, violent crime, financial crime, official corruption, but also a few political trials that I'm looking at. I'm taking another look at the Nechayev trial, for example. So like the way they basically were trying to rebuild the Russian ruling class, to rebuild the deep state, again, to use that metaphor. And basically they kind of, because it was such a lively exchange, because the courts basically kind of substituted for the lack of a parliament, right? It was so lively that they basically could not come up with a set of narratives that would just kind of take over, right? At the same time, now I'm still kind of bracketing this thought out. Like right now, I'm focusing on the process through which at least the judiciary, but also the people who are involved in attending trials, staging the trials, running the trials, at least they created this forum in which they could discuss all these really sensitive issues. And this case today, exposing how the Imperial Orphanage really functions, it's just really pretty mild compared to some of these other things I'm writing about, like the regional doctor's plot, the abortion case from Ryazan in 1873. I mean, there's some really unbelievable stuff, like poisoning cases exposing the bourgeois family. These are all kinds of stuff about how banks work, for example, very sensitive, and at least you could have that kind of discussion, at least for the time being. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on right now. And sort of another quick word about this stupidity versus treason argument. How I came to it originally? I think I should mention this. There's this sort of major principle in Anglo-American common law of trusts, which is it's really very important for understanding how 19th century worked, because what was so weird about the late 19th century is that everybody is basically working for somebody else, and you formal complex institutions are not quite all there yet, but the economy is complex enough as that you always have to find somebody to do stuff for you, right? And so you always have to use these trustees and agents. And in English law, there was duty of loyalty and duty of care. Like if you look at any restatement of the law, right? So your trustee must act, in the principal's interest, and must do it with certain degree of competence. And Russian law, was categorizing this differently. There were different legal categories, but the principles, I think, are there also. And that's kind of that led me directly to Milyukov's quote. So I think this dichotomy kind of underlines a lot of what is happening in the 19th century, which is why I think it's so helpful for this forum. But yes, so I think Christine's question about discrediting the government, or how the legal system was a little bit of a kind of a danger to the government. I mean, I think it's always the case a little bit, I think, potentially, right? But I mean, definitely in Russia, it was definitely very explosive climate, let's put it this way. So yeah, I mean, I agree with that.
I have one small question. I think it's important though. I wasn't quite clear why at the end of the day, Khmelnytsky turned himself in. Why did he have this concoct this story? Or what's your view on why he turned himself in?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really great question. So, you know, it's like, I think like you have this kind of cultural motif, so to say, in like, in some of these cases, to just kind of resolve your troubles, all your troubles, through like one forcible action. You know, it goes almost like to Nietzsche in a sense. Like these people didn't read Nietzsche or anything like that. Like, you know, I'm just going to cut through the red tape and just do it. And in other more unfortunate cases, like the student Danilov, who killed a moneylender, and he was not the prototype for Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov. It's just he happened to have committed that crime like exactly once when Crime and Punishment was coming out, right? So like this notion, I think, was definitely in the air. And same thing here is like, why do you spend, you know, years and years embezzling 100 rubles here, 100 rubles there, if you can just take everything, right? Just go ahead and just take it. And that's what he seems to have done. And you would expect like, yeah, well, why didn't he just, you know, get on a train and go to Poland, then from there go to Berlin, right? He probably could have done it before anybody knew, right, what had happened. But it never occurred to him to just separate himself from his, you know, environment of, you know, Tver province where he was from. You know, there's this small town of Kercheva that's now is underwater because of this like a reservoir there, or the Hraniliще. Yet it never occurred to him. Well, I mean, it really beats me like why he didn't want to, why didn't he just run away abroad with all this money? I mean, I think these banknotes, they would probably eventually discover what their numbers were and send the numbers to like officials in Europe, to the embassies, and it would probably eventually catch him one way or another. But also, I mean, I think he thought he was being clever, I think, because like he knew he would be arrested. He knew he would be put on trial because that was just standard procedure. It was like inevitable. So like what else he could have done? And I think it was much better for him to just kind of just come in crying. I mean, I think it was a rational choice, but it's yeah. I mean, I think today people would just escape to Canada and lie low, right?
Yeah, because I mean, it goes back to the end of the day that there is this structure that he knows that X, Y, and Z will happen if he does turn himself in now. Dependent upon that, or he's assuming something about that. So it's about this underlying incentive system as to what he is doing. I'll ask another question too, maybe for this audience, something that struck me a little bit in reading what you were writing is that sort of various entities here seem sort of extremely wary of scandal. This maybe go back to Christine's point, like scandal seems like the thing to avoid at all cost. And again, in my sort of comparative hat, I was trying to think, well, is that, you know, and I'll admit I have seen a few episodes of Bridgerton in the last week or two. So you know, their scandal really seemed to matter, really was something that even official government institutions were, you know, trying to avoid, which is somewhat, you know, I don't know, surprising. I mean, this goes maybe back, you know, public opinion and autocracies in general, right? They don't ignore public opinion, but they manipulate it and they use it to their own ends. So I don't know if you want to comment on that as to the notion of scandal in this context.
Yeah, I would be very, very happy to, because there's this really helpful article about the British context called "The Quiet Thieves, Quiet Punishment." But the guy, I think his first name is John Locker. I think his last name is Locker. And it's basically about how, like in the English context, you know, white collar crime scandals were kind of more frequently, you know, handled in-house, basically. So just simply like if you catch a clerk stealing from you, it was cheaper, more effective, and just as damaging to the offender to just fire him and make sure that he never gets hired again anywhere else, that like instead of paying all this money to actually do a prosecution, and then if you prosecute somebody, prosecute fraud was hard because you had to show intent, right? So like intent to steal, and so like you couldn't be sure that you would succeed. So it's actually, it was not a nice environment. It may look like it's permissive to us, and avoidance of scandal doesn't mean that these people were vegetarian, right? That they just were like had some concern for these embezzlers' feelings. But I'm also found some evidence that this was the case in Russia as well, not just how these cases that Steve read about were handled, but like in memoirs, like this merchant Varintsov, who has a famous set of memoirs. It was just saying like, yeah, we would catch these clerks and we would just like fire them quietly. And that's frankly, how a lot of white collar scandals are handled today as well. And I've done some, in my brief tenure as a lawyer, I was working on some of those white collar crime cases that came out after the Enron scandal, and there were we just think about Enron, but there were dozens and dozens of prosecutions that like didn't go anywhere, were just kind of handled quietly, and I know just through my personal kind of acquaintances that like today in Northeast United States, let's put it this way, it's pretty common when you catch like an officer in your organization misusing money, that person will be just kind of fired quietly. That's I think is pretty common, because and I think Steve was just wonderful question, because like in this other case I'm writing about, the Yuhantsov case, the reason why Yuhantsov was fired and then caught having stolen money is that because people who just have some doubt that like somebody in the organization might be stealing, they would just basically go in and take their money out of that bank, right? But so like even if you catch the embezzler, your investor is still going to pull the money, right? So it's makes sense to handle it quietly. But yeah, it's a great issue.
Thank you. I just have one, actually, a comment, a very obvious comment from the point of view of a literature person, and that is, as you've already suggested, how incredibly Dostoevskian this is. In two ways that really strike me is the importance of scandal, sort of public exposure, and which structures so many of Dostoevsky's works, like this moment of scandal, shame, revelation. And the second thing is when you were talking about why this person confessed instead of just like running away or sneaking away. And and you said it was a way of like kind of dramatically cutting through all the red tape, jumping ahead of the process, like this one gesture that's going to sort of put an end to all of the entanglements. That's also exactly what that is one reading of Crime and Punishment. That what Raskolnikov is trying to do is essentially like jump ahead in history by cutting through all of this kind of bullshit. And that's not my reading. That's Ilya Krieger's reading of Crime and Punishment that I think would be really useful for this. And it has to do with confession and what confession accomplishes. So those were two possibly kind of obvious Dostoevsky comments. But my question, and it's a very basic question, has to do with the money as a physical object. So if he had gotten together all this money and managed to take it, as you said, across the border somewhere, then what would he have done with the actual money? Like what paths would have been open to him?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, this is all great. By the way, I would love to sort of get a reference for Krieger's work.
I'll send it to you.
Thanks. I think so. It would be really fascinating. But in terms of money, well, how I've seen cases of people actually stealing money and taking it abroad. I think the revolutionaries have done it a few times after their exes, so-called, right? Well, I mean, I know exactly what his children did with the money, because much of the case record explains that. How the children and other relatives who were hiding the cash from Magnitsky, and it's basically like Count Monte Cristo, but in real life. It's like you get your own business, and you get yourself some nice clothes from Paris, and you get yourself a new apartment, and you buy yourself new horses. And they waited for a few months, but they should have waited a little longer. So it was basically like their stupidity that got them caught. But the police seems like had their spies in the household, and they were like being informed of what was happening. But in terms of what would you do abroad, I mean, probably the same things, but in relative safety. Now, I've done quite a lot of work on counterfeiters, and sort of like how sort of these kind of transnational ties were really important, how like cash was printed in places like Switzerland, England, Belgium, and then smuggled into Russia. And so like there were definitely kind of like ways to move money, ways to move wealth, ways to enjoy it. So I'm positive they would have thought of something, right? And the key thing about this counterfeiting example is that like governments locally, like the British government, the Belgian government, the French government, they could care less what you did with fake money or stolen money, as long as it was not your own money. As long as you didn't mess with pounds, they could care less what you did with other nations' currencies. So you could print as many rubles as you wanted. They really did not care. So
that is really fascinating. Thank you. I guess I'm always trying to get my head around how these financial instruments carry value around, right? And how that value changes when you take them from Switzerland to Russia or whatever. So I did not know that governments didn't care what you did with other states' money, but it makes sense. Thank you.
And vice versa. Foreign money was used pretty commonly in Russia. So like, for example, the Yuhantsov scandal in St. Petersburg was one of the biggest. Like he stole money that was denominated in pounds sterling, not in rubles. And it was about 1:10 ratio. So it was like 120,000 pounds. That was like over 1 million rubles. So it was interesting.
Thank you. Do we
Thanks.
have more questions? I think everyone is going to really be looking forward to this book, Sergei. We're going to learn a lot. And it seems like it's going to speak to people in many different disciplines. So good luck with the project. We're all looking forward to it. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you.
Thank you so much.
In a couple weeks.